All right. So I guess for the sake of time, we might as well go ahead and get started. I'm really, really excited to be a part of this conference. This is kind of a fun merging of my past and present worlds. I grew up in West Texas and Midland, but ran away to New York for 10 years and went to Pratt for grad school for planning. So I worked at Regional Plan Association and spent kind of my professional life in New York, and then kind of made the jump and moved back to Texas 2 years ago with my wife, just because we were ready for a change of pace. And I'm really loving it. Got a job with the city of San Antonio and have met these wonderful, fine people who I'm so excited to be working with today. So my name is Sarah Surpass. I'm with the planning department with my coworker Anna, who should be joining us back soon. She's having some technical problems. We also have Claudia Guerra with us from our Office of Historic Preservation. She is our first cultural historian. And then we have Jonathan Butler, who is one of our equity managers at our city's Office of Equity, who's been active with all of us for the last couple years, last year maybe. So myself, Claudia, Anna are all equity trainers within our departments. So we're going to talk about kind of the framework that our Office of Equity is using in kind of normalizing, operationalizing, and making sure that we're talking about equity in all that we do. So I'm going to pass it off to Claudia to get us started. Audio went away.
Sorry, I'll pull back my screen. If I can reach it. Apologies. While I'm getting it back up, I will say, similar to Sarah, I lived in New York for quite a long time. I like to say that I was born and raised in San Antonio, but I grew up in New York City, where I lived for almost 16 years before coming back to San Antonio, in a state of bewilderment, trying to understand this place I had grown up in, which was so different from my second home, New York, and ended up becoming the cultural historian about 6 years ago. So I appreciate San Antonio being invited to present here, and I appreciate being able to work with my colleagues on this and thank them for inviting me to present with them. And I think this is an excellent example of how San Antonio is working across departments to achieve equity. So as the city's cultural historian, what I'm going to try and do first is just kind of set the scene with a historic overview of San Antonio. And I'm going to go through it very fast. There are so many things, each of these little topics that I'm going to touch on could be an entire lecture in and of themselves, but I'm going to try and hit on some of those really top points, because San Antonio is a city that's really rooted in a very historic urban plan that was created by the Spanish Crown. And it's a place that was and continues to be a cultural crossroads interwoven with economics, religion, military, and not least health and illness. So I chose this opening picture because it's an iconic image of San Antonio. It shows our intangible heritage through these women who we call tortilleras, women who make tortillas, and historically they made them by hand. And I chose this because it's a picture that shows us not just about food traditions, but about how immigration affected our city, affected our health, city planning, and the San Antonio we know today through technological heritage. But before we delve into that story, I'd like to provide a land acknowledgement. We want to acknowledge that we live and work on the traditional land of the Cahuiltecan peoples, past and present, and honor with gratitude the land, the waters, the spirits of place, and the people who have stewarded it through the generations. This calls us as public servants to commit to continuing to learn how to be better stewards of the land we inhabit as well. So one of the first things we can do towards that commitment, I think, is to recognize that the place that we are in, which we call San Antonio, is known as Yanaguana to the Cahuiltecan community. Yanaguana means place of refreshing waters, and was a spiritual home to the Payaya, the Mano Negros, the Tepuan, the Tehuan, and other clans who are known under the collective Cahuiltecan name. It was also part of the ancestral intercontinental trade route for the indigenous empires that crisscrossed the Americas. all of which offered a very attractive location for Spanish colonization, which, like in many colonized parts of the Americas, brought with the colonists some illnesses. Texas people were devastated by the European diseases shortly after the Spanish arrive in Mexico and make their way into San Antonio. So one of the first things that the Spanish do is establish the law of the Indies here in town. I'm sure many of you know, but in case you don't, I'm going to say the law of the Indies was basically a master plan. It was created by the Spanish to colonize the New World. Issued in 1573 by King Felipe II, the law of the Indies is regarded as the first urban planning manual to reach the Americas. It codified the placement of the religious center, military, municipal centers, and the street grid around them. And in San Antonio, it also regulated the use of water through a system of acequias, which are basically ditches, irrigation ditches and canals that provided water for crops and for hygiene. And this would become very important later in the way the city itself would develop around these acequias and the kind of water and the kind of people who had access to water or didn't have access to water. So just to give you an idea of what it might have looked like, this was a typical dwelling. And for those of you who have been to San Antonio and maybe have seen our missions, the original missions would have been structures that were not very different from these. What we call them locally are jacales, but they're basically a thatch, wattle, and daub dwelling. These are some historic images of what we would have seen around San Antonio, particularly the south and west sides of San Antonio. And I think Anna's going to talk a little bit more about the west side in her presentation, so I won't dwell too long on that. But you can imagine that living conditions were difficult, and they were especially so for those of lower economic means. Disease was rampant. This is an aviso al pueblo, which means it is a notice, a public notice that was issued in 1867. Spanish continued to be the major language in San Antonio very late into the 19th century. This one is announcing a cholera epidemic, which had begun actually in 1849. The cholera pandemic of 1849 killed 600 San Antonians out of a population of 5,000 within weeks. San Antonio was not alone in facing disease. Newspaper accounts in the San Antonio Light and San Antonio Express News reveal worldwide pandemics of yellow fever, flu, and cholera, among other plagues, which led to quarantine similar to the COVID-19 pandemic we face today. The afflictions, along with advancing medical technology, led to the creation of municipal health boards and sanitation ordinances. In 1854, San Antonio created the Office of City Physician, followed 4 years by the development of the San Antonio Board of Health on February 12, 1858. At the time, the causes of these diseases were still unknown, but physicians generally considered disease to be transmitted through unsanitary conditions and the inability to access fresh water for food handling and hand washing. In order to improve citizens' well-being, the Board of Health recommended that standing water be eliminated from street gutters, removal of garbage and other filth from streets, reduction of overcrowding in the jail, improved requirements for tenement housing, and the relocation of military camps beyond the city. Yellow fever, scarlet fever, and measles plagued San Antonio through the late 19th and early 20th century. And one of the interesting things was the patients were ordered to quarantine themselves, much as we are now, but the cases would be noted in local newspapers and the addresses of the quarantine would be listed. And no surprise, those addresses tended to be in the same areas where today we are seeing a predominance of the underrepresented being affected by COVID-19. Which brings me back to the story of tortillas. So I was very intrigued, as many people are intrigued, by the word Sanitary Tortillas, which is a company that still exists in San Antonio and which we have made a legacy business because they've been making tortillas without the touch of human hands since 1925. And I put up this ad so we could see the reason this becomes so important is that the word sanitary meant to people that they could trust the food, they could trust whatever product was being bought at the time. Since then, not a lot of the businesses that use sanitary in their name continue to stand, but Sanitary Tortillas does. And it sounds strange to our ears, but basically at the time of Sanitary Tortillas in 1925, it was a marketing term. And tortillas become especially important at this time because San Antonio's population doubled between 1910 and 1920 because of the Mexican Civil War. Many refugees settled here in San Antonio, and in fact, the person who invented this tortilla machine was from Mexico. But you could see the word sanitary in a lot of marketing at the time. You could get a sanitary kitchen set, you could get a sanitary refrigerator, you could even get a sanitary bedroom suite. And more importantly, you could get a sanitary bathroom, which all of this indicates some means of wealth, which was not necessarily true for a lot of our citizens. In fact, on the West Side, this is a picture from the time period. Many people did not have access to running water. That structure that's in the middle of the screen is a community bathroom. There would have been one bathroom per block in many of the areas of the West Side. Those structures that you see around them, the shotgun houses, many of the areas like this were called corrales, which does mean what it means in English, which is basically a corral. It's a very derogatory term, essentially. The effect of water in San Antonio, lack of access to water, but yet flooding, prone to flooding, meant that a lot of these neighborhoods were also some of those that were most affected by floods in 1913, 1925, and 1940. The photographs here from the 1920s, and you can see there was a Spanish language publication that talked about how on the better parts of town, people lost carpets and pianos, but on the West Side, people lost mothers, fathers, and children. So the idea of urban renewal begins to spark at about this time, with some of the first public housing taking over the idea of shotgun houses like we're seeing here, and the first public housing starting to be built in the 1930s, some of which still exist today, and which we are now just entering in sort of a battle as to whether they should be preserved or not. But there were thousands of demolitions of housing that people had, and there are stories when I do interviews with people who lived through that time or whose parents lived through that time of people going to work or going to school and then coming home and finding that their house had been demolished in the meantime. And so you can imagine that that sort of dynamic created a lack of trust in government. And here are just some stories that were documented in the paper about so-called slums and, you know, the death that was occurring in them, the epidemics and diseases that were happening then. All of that, and I think one of my colleagues will talk more about redlining, allowed redlining basically to happen in San Antonio. And here are some maps that I'll just touch on very briefly. The areas that are in red are the areas that were obviously redlined, and they happen to coincide with a study that we're doing now. It's part of the Office of Historic Preservation, and that is to find every single shotgun house that still exists in San Antonio. And you can see, as when I transpose these maps on top of each other, that most of those shotgun houses continue to exist in areas that have been redlined. And the reason that we think this is important now is because this is the last remnant of affordable housing in San Antonio. That red dot that's in the middle is the historic center of San Antonio. That's downtown. So these areas where the shotgun housing and other types of affordable housing exist right now are under high threat and demand for redevelopment, for more expensive housing, to lure other people into living into San Antonio area. So these neighborhoods are under a lot of pressure and feeling the forces of gentrification starting to come at them. So one of our main initiatives this year is to save houses we can, and to create opportunity for rehabilitation and showing that these are the original tiny house. You know, it's such a craze now. Why would we want to get rid of housing that is actually affordable now and continues to exist, especially if we can rehab them? And I'm happy to talk about that more if we want to during the question and answer period. But I wanted to just give you a quick background also on the historic preservation initiatives in general. We have 31 local historic districts, which is one of the largest number of districts in the United States. We have over 1,600 local landmarks. So when you count all of those landmarks in historic districts, plus those that are individual, we have well over 12,000 landmarks in San Antonio. Each of these program areas for us, design review, archaeology, survey and designation, the vacant building program, and the living heritage program, are all working under a lens of equity. So we are looking to ensure that we're not only preserving those mansions or those beautiful gilded architectural gems that everybody thinks of, but also those gems and treasures that are important to community. So that's what we call living heritage. We established that this department in 2015 at about the same time that I was hired. And the goal of it was to make sure that we are representing every community member and their community through their eyes. So we conduct oral histories, we conduct cultural mapping, any other ways that we can identify places that may be important to community, but we wouldn't be able to see because we are not the experts in that community. So we really rely on community telling us what's important to them. Another thing that we're trying to understand is the types of historic building trades that were building these structures, because we think that there's a revival of that and that we can create new workforce through that, especially during the time of COVID-19, where our economy is really struggling. As I mentioned, public participation is crucial. This is a place where we were a charrette, where we were working on a beloved landmark that was in threat of being demolished, and we were working with community and the local AIA chapter to develop alternative plans for how we might save the structure. And in the corner is a map that was provided to me by a community member after conducting an oral history. I asked her to draw a map of the stories, and what we were able to develop was an understanding of her neighborhood through her eyes and those places that were important to her. So under the Living Heritage Program, we have three main initiatives. That's to develop cultural heritage districts, which do not fall under historic regulation laws, but which build awareness and civic pride in areas that may not be ready for historic designation, either because there's a fear of it or because the community is just not interested in it, but they want the honorific understanding of it. The Living Heritage Symposium, which everyone on this presentation is invited to come to. We will hold it in 2021 in the fall. We've already held 3. And this is to discuss the problems that communities and neighborhoods and how we can make them more economically viable through preservation. And then finally, our last program is Legacy Businesses, which I briefly mentioned with Sanitary Tortilla. And that's to really highlight every business in San Antonio that has existed for 20 more years and contributes to an authentic sense of the culture in San Antonio. So that in brief is kind of what we're doing.
I think your audio cut out, Claudia. Awesome. I think your audio cut out at the end there. You know, things are just a little weird. And I think, Anna, I'm getting a little bit of feedback from you if you want to mute yourself. Awesome. Okay. Thank you so much. I'm going to switch us to the next presentation. And can everyone hear me okay? Just thumbs up, yes. Great. Okay. Let's see if I can. Okay. So now that we kind of have in kind of the history of San Antonio, some of our past pandemics, some of our history of colonization, myself and Anna are going to talk through kind of what we're doing at the planning department. We at the planning department are a little different than some other planning departments across the country, where us specifically in the planning department work on long range plans, where we also have a development services department that does kind of day-to-day zoning. So we get to think big picture, long term, how are we planning, where are we growing, which I think is really exciting, and do kind of large area rezonings to align that vision with the policy underneath it. So this is us. I'm going to talk through a little bit about some population trends that we're seeing in San Antonio. First off, I just want to give you kind of an introduction to where we are. We are at the bottom corner of what is called the Texas Triangle. We're about an hour south of Austin, about 3 hours west of Houston, and maybe 4 to 5 hours south of Dallas, depending on traffic on 35, which can be kind of a nightmare. But this is kind of our mega region that we're a part of. In the map to the right here, you see our city boundary, which has changed a lot over the years and also has these kind of cutouts of other municipalities within it, creating a bit of a Swiss cheese situation. So our boundary changes with annexations, it changes with these municipalities, it changes with military initiatives. Military is a big industry here. We have an Air Force base, Lackland Air Force Base, Fort Sam Houston. It's kind of a historic military base, Camp Bullis up here. So that's kind of one of our big economic drivers. We also have a big tourism industry with our missions. The Spanish colonial missions are a national park. We have a river walk, which is downtown, and to me is a big river, but I know to a lot of people is very tiny. But it's a beautiful kind of commercial space where people can go and walk around. But this is kind of the introduction to who we are and where we are. And within that city boundary we just saw, there are 1.5 million people, which surprises people. We are, just based on our city boundary, we are the largest, or the second largest city in Texas, and the 7th largest nationally. So including other areas and metropolitan areas, we shrink a little bit because we're not as dense as some other places. But just our municipal boundary itself, we are the 2nd largest in Texas and the 7th largest in the country. So that's something just I feel like is important to think about. We also have a vibrant kind of tourism industry, or at least we usually do. Right now, COVID has kind of impacted that. I pulled all of these from one of our kind of tourism websites, and it just kind of gives you a sense of what types of things San Antonio is known for. We typically have a large Dia de Muertos festival. This was done virtually this year, but there are altars downtown. People set up their own. It's a really beautiful thing. We have lots of annual festivals. We have one called Fiesta, which is a citywide event with parades, riverboat parades, lots of heritage, lots of culture. We also are a site for kind of German immigration, so that heritage still exists. We have a big rodeo in different parts of the year. And we also have the largest MLK march in the country, which is sadly canceled for this year. So all this culture kind of makes San Antonio who we are, but at the same time, we also have some deep divides. First of all, we're one of the most economically segregated places in the country, and there's a significant difference between the north and the south part of town. So this map is showing you the percent of households earning less than median income by zip code. So you can see to the north, we have kind of wealthier areas, and to the south and west and east, like Claudia was talking about, are more lower income areas. We had a community visioning project called SA 2020 done about 10 years ago. And one of the goals was to reduce the amount of income segregation. And we still haven't arrived there. We still have about 50% of the city is highly income segregated, both high and low. And comparison to other regions, we are, this is analysis done by Richard Florida, he's a complicated guy. I don't usually support him, but this is a good analysis that he did, showing that San Antonio in 2014 was the most economically income segregated large metro. This includes New Braunfels, so it's a little bit of a larger area, but higher than New York City, which I think is notable. And of course, well, not of course, but just in our system of inequality in our country, economic segregation also relates to racial segregation. This is the kind of publicly available dot density map showing race and ethnicity in San Antonio. This is our kind of central downtown loop, which was also a product of urban renewal. So this is kind of, there's not much population in the downtown core itself, but that is changing. But we have a pretty dense Hispanic Latinx population to the west. Our Black population is primarily to the east, and the white population is primarily to the north. We do have a concentration of Asian population near what we call the medical center and out near our major university, UTSA. So we are majority Hispanic or Latinx, 65%, about a quarter white, non-Hispanic, but that is for, again, that city boundary. So some of those other municipalities that pop out, like Alamo Heights, like Castle Hills, are not included in this total, but they are their own municipalities. So that creates some kind of interesting power dynamics as well. Something our Office of Equity did was combine that concept of income segregation and racial segregation into an index. So this is our Equity Atlas index to use to inform our work. So the areas in darkest blue are areas that are low income and predominantly people of color. And non-surprisingly, these areas do align with past redlining, and we can really see the echoes of that past policy in our urban fabric. So this is really something we have to take into account as we do our planning. The next few slides I'm going to go through pretty quickly. They're giving you kind of an overview of how we've grown as a city. So this is showing you the population density in 1960. You can see in the middle, we had kind of most of our population in the core. We also had, before this, we had some cool trolley system, and all of that's gone now. But this shows you kind of where population was concentrated. I'm going to click through the next few decades pretty quickly, and you'll just see how we grew. 1960, 70, 80, 90, 2000, 2010. So most of our growth has gone to the north of the city. We have our kind of major interstate loop, Loop 410 here, and there's a secondary loop, 1604, out here on the outskirts. So this is kind of where our growth has been shifting, is outward, more suburban. And if we look at that kind of overall, even though our population has climbed, here shown in the blue, our population density has declined. This is because our city boundary has grown with our population, and that makes it really difficult to maintain kind of a dense urban form. And this is a trend across the country. This is a grid done by the New York Times showing cities that had an increase in population compared to their change in density. So we're down here with all of these other cities, with Austin, with San Antonio, Houston, Dallas, Raleigh, Nashville, cities that are growing but becoming less dense. So this is something as the planning department we hope to address. Even though we've had some new mixed use projects in the city in recent years, we're still becoming less dense. And many of those projects aren't affordable to the people who live in San Antonio, and that's something we have to consider as well. Compared to other cities in Texas, San Antonio doesn't have as intense of traffic congestion, but we can if we keep growing. That's something we really have to look out for. And we also have to think about how much we've invested in our roads compared to how much we've invested in our transportation. White residents are more likely to own cars, and we have to make sure that our transportation system is equitable. So all of that's some background. I'm just going to give you a quick overview on what we do at the planning department. Our biggest challenge is that we're expecting 1.1 million new people to come to Bexar County within the next 20 years. This is not into San Antonio specifically, but into San Antonio and the surrounding areas. And lots of people assume this is all in migration. This is people from California moving to San Antonio, to Austin, to Texas. A lot of it is actually natural increase. So it's people having kids and wanting to stay here. That's kind of our primary growth driver. But we have to think about where people are going to live and if they're going to be able to stay here and what types of jobs they will have. Our answer to this was in 2016 to adopt a comprehensive plan that really looked long-term and tried to identify key issues. This plan involved lots of community engagement. It covered the entire city and kind of had broad brushstrokes on how we want to grow, what types of ways we want to see our city thrive in the future. But this plan does not have a full future land use map. So in New York, I know there's not much land use planning. It's kind of more of a zoning and policy framework. In San Antonio, we're really trying to create a set of future land use maps that we can use to guide rezonings. And the way we're doing that is that we've split the city into 30 different areas and are doing plans for each of these areas. So within this map, it's kind of a crazy color map because it's showing not only the types of areas, but the timing and when we're going to do them. So in blues, you see what we call our regional centers. So these are our significant economic hubs. We found that not only do we have kind of economic activity in our downtown, but we have 12 other kind of satellite downtowns where we should focus our attention in terms of future growth. So these areas already have jobs. They could have more jobs and they could have more housing. And in pushing our growth into those areas, we can connect them with transit. We can also kind of preserve the affordable housing that might be in the neighborhoods nearby in these yellow areas that we call our community areas. And this is kind of our framework for thinking about our city, having these nodes of economic activity and pushing growth into there. So each of these plans that we're working on has a planning team of local stakeholders. It has a designated planning department staff person who is project managing the process. We have neighborhood representation, employer representation. We try to do different types of community involvement, which Anna's going to talk about a little more. And we really try to take into account everything on the ground right now and guide a future land use map that can be used to drive the future growth. And this gets used by lots of different agencies within the city. Primarily, if a developer was coming in and wanted to rezone, say, this parcel to residential, but the future land use map said that it should be commercial or mixed use or multifamily residential, it couldn't be single family like he was trying to do, then we would have the ability to shift that rezoning. So this is kind of ensuring and putting into a framework how we are growing. All right, with that, I will pass it off to Anna.
Okay, can you guys hear me well? Perfect. So as Sarah previously mentioned, this comprehensive plan is quite innovative for the city of San Antonio, and that is because of the level of engagement that we've done in each area. So throughout the planning process, we have been very invested in trying to understand each community, how each community functions and how should, or maybe how it shouldn't function or change over time. So throughout this process, we'll always try to circle back and answer 3 specific questions. The first one is who we are, knowing that getting to know our people is key to a successful sub-area plan. The second is where are we going? So what's the vision of the community? And the third one is how are we going to get there? So what are those policies and partnerships that are going to be needed to achieve this vision? Here you can see, give me 1 second. I'm seeing different slides. Here are the kinds of different strategies that we've implemented in the past. We've kind of adapted our community strategies based on the area, what the community needs, and now with COVID-19, but I'm going to touch a little bit more of how that's changed. Move on this presentation. So this is our first question. Like I mentioned, we try to really get to know the community and start to create those partnerships. And this is specifically the West Side. Here you see the mural that welcomes the parts of the area, and it kind of like embraces the culture and the history that you can see throughout the land. This is, what you see shaded dark green is the back.
Did we lose just Anna?
Can you click next?
I can hear you. Okay, good.
Okay, so just to give you a little bit more context on how the West Side, or what the composition of the West Side is, here's some population and housing numbers. And just to highlight, there's a high concentration of family households and a significantly higher average household size than the city overall. And also this area is overwhelmingly Hispanic, with 95% of the population being of Hispanic origin, which is very high compared of the 65% of with the rest of the city and the MSA. So to have a comprehensive understanding of like all the existing conditions of the area, on the early stages of the plan, we try to make an assessment of the current conditions. So some of the things that we go out and study are like natural systems, mobility, infrastructure, and the economic development for that area. And all of that gets incorporated into the plan. So once this analysis of existing conditions are completed, then we go into the second question of where are we going? So we all try to answer this question. And to do that, we compiled like a planning team and community members, and we collectively identify what are the most important values, what are the strengths, what are the challenges, and also what are the opportunities that are present. So just to give you an idea, some of the most important goals for that area was preservation of the cultural heritage and amenities that are currently present, and also supporting balanced growth that preserves stability and character. Because as Claudia mentioned, there's a lot of gentrification and a lot of development. So they're very concerned with maintaining that stability and also overcoming barriers that have for long separated the west side from the city. And as part of that development of each plan and some of the partnerships that are created, we organize focus groups. So these focus groups touch in different topics that will then get added to the comprehensive plan, to the sub-area plan. And some of those topics that we assess is education, wellness, safety, public services, transportation, and culture. So once we have a vision, then we develop the framework. And these are the three things that go into that prioritizing projects, action plan, guiding the creation and adoption of the ordinances that are going to make that vision come true. And the West Side had been doing really well. There was a lot of clarity and traction, but then the pandemic happened. And so it brought like this huge new wave of challenges to that area, communication being one. So communication with residents had definitely been a challenge. Because there's a lot of disparities and of access to technological resources on the area. So this digital divide is very critical for communities like the West Side. They have been historically marginalized, and so in many ways they have been very disconnected from opportunities and for access to very critical things such as social services, health services, continuing education, and also what we've come to know very important is the social connections. So this long and persistent digital divide is a very big issue for the city right now. So our local leaders are attempting to address this, and they have partnered with the Office of Innovation, Smart SA, the Burke County Commissioners Court, and also the local university, UTSA, to create this one study that they titled Digital Inclusion Survey and Assessment. And it was just completed this June 2020, and it shows the significant connectivity obstacles throughout the city. And this one map that you see on the screen is the Bexar County map, and it shows like the very clear gap of broadband connection between zip codes. So on that study, participants not using the internet were asked to highlight the reasons why. So here I'm going to mention the top three, which is I can't afford a monthly payment. I don't have a device to access that internet. And also internet connection in my area is unreliable or too slow. So here we see how for those that remain unconnected, affordability, device accessibility, and connectivity are very, very big barriers. And another question that was also presented in that study revealed that nearly 1 in 4 Hispanics and Black respondents do not have wired internet connection. So, you know, that leaves all the citizens that don't have that access to rely on public Wi-Fi, hotspots, and mobile data to browse the internet. So what's alarming here is that only about 57% of residents that earn less than $20,000 actually have access to internet. So how does that affect planning? How does that affect the city? Well, it affects it a lot. It poses a great challenge to all of our engagement, productivity, education, suffers when there's no clear path of communication. So, you know, us as planners, we acknowledge that there's no planning that can be really, truly comprehensive unless there's social inclusion. So, you know, this has been a really big challenge for the city and for our department specifically. So as we adapt to all this craziness and new safety guidelines into our work, we've had to really sit down and analyze each area, identify what's the proficiency level for the citizens, and also what's the access that they have to technology. And with that, we developed like specific strategies that are targeted to that intended audience. So for the West Side, I'm going to give you an example. The project manager surveyed, identified, and accommodated the community's preferred virtual platform. So there's new things that we have been incorporating, such as online and text surveys, virtual office hours. And one big thing for our department that we've really tried to make the effort is to translate all communications to have that greater reach in areas like the West Side. The pandemic, and that now see the problem they're displayed.
I think we're having some audio issues.
They look the same. The same areas are usually the ones that are affected in terms of poverty and inequality and low income. And so, you know, the main strategy that we've tried to come up with is to work with different departments, including the Office of Equity, which has been a really, really big ally to our department.
Awesome. Okay, I think Anna's having some audio issues, but really they only started kind of at the end. Otherwise, we could hear you just fine. But with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jonathan Butler, who is one of our equity managers in our Office of Equity.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's great to be with you all. Morning for some of you, afternoon for others. I'm thankful to join our planning department. I have worked well with Sarah and Anna since my time joining the city of San Antonio. And whenever I can share the stage with Claudia, I feel a special sense of gratitude. I'm going to kind of speed through my slides, ladies and gentlemen, because I am conscious of time, and I want to make sure that you all have plenty of time to answer questions and ask more questions. Sarah, if you would just go to the next slide. I have to catch myself also sometimes in presenting as I give a little bit about my road to the room. I've facilitated different discussions for so long in life, and oftentimes I began those discussions by saying, ladies and gentlemen, great about my own personal evolution and growth in my own journey, which I think is apparent for all of us as we talk about doing equity work, is if you notice, I reverted back to some of my old tendencies in saying, ladies and gentlemen. I recognize that all folks don't identify in that way. And so I just wanted to course correct as I pay acknowledgement that in equity work, we're not perfect and we are all evolving and transforming. So I wanted to make that small acknowledgement for you all as I heard my own words. My road to the room, really quickly, I'm a native Atlantan. I'm an attorney by training. I've done a myriad of different things in my career and made my way into public service by working in affordable housing initiatives in Chattanooga, Tennessee, for the Department of Economic and Community Development there before I joined our team with the Office of Equity here in San Antonio, Texas, almost a year and a half ago. Next slide, Sarah. Sarah, Anna, and Claudia introduced you all to some of San Antonio. This is also San Antonio. We are one of the leading cities in income segregation. My co-panelists have pointed some of these things out in terms of disparities in housing burden. 1 in 6 people, 1 in 5 children in San Antonio live in poverty. In addition to income and geography, race is still a predictor of our community's outcomes, of which the current pandemic really does accentuate. Next slide, Sarah. People of color are 2 and 3 times more likely to live in poverty than whites. The median hourly income for whites is higher. People of color are more likely to be unemployed. The rate of home ownership for whites is twice as high as that of Black households. Next slide, Sarah. Some of this data has already been pointed out. Residents in our northern side of town actually have lifespans that are longer by almost 20 years than those in our southern part of our city. Next slide, Sarah. The legacy of redlining, as Anna pointed out, still continues to define what is happening to us in San Antonio. The left side represents the red line maps of the 30s and 40s. The shades of deep blue and purple on the right side represent the areas of the highest concentrations of segregated communities of color and lower income residents. With the assistance of Sarah and Anna and the planning department and our IT department, we created the Equity Atlas to emphasize disparities, highlight the communities experiencing the most economic challenges, and the data tells us the communities that are most in need. This helps guide our investments and our work to achieve citywide equity goals. Next slide, please. Why is racial equity in government so important? Racial inequities continue to be deep, pervasive, and persistent across all indicators of success, including education, jobs, housing, income, and health. Government at all levels has played a role in creating and maintaining racial inequities and disparate outcomes, even if the intent to discriminate is and was not present. Examining institutional policies and practices is required to address the underlying drivers of racial inequities, and local governments can proactively advance racial equity by explicitly focusing on the needs of communities of color. The next slide, Sarah. As we transition into how we define equity, we define it as our policymaking, service delivery, and distribution of resources should account for the different histories that Claudia talked about so eloquently, the challenges and the needs of the people that we serve. We believe that equity is achieved when one's identity cannot predict one's outcomes, and we focus on it being data-driven, attempting to address some of the root causes and being proactive and people-centered in our decision-making, our data collection, and our policy making. Next slide, Sarah. Our office works with the government of Alliance for Race and Equity. We have adopted their theory of change of normalizing concepts within city government based in social justice principles, organizing our staff around advancing equity in those departments. Sarah, Claudia, and Anna all participate in our trainer program and are also extensions in our citywide equity committee. And then we operationalize equitable policies, programs, and procedures within the city. Our office is a citywide office that has its roots in connecting to all of the departments within the city. Next slide, please. We formulated our equity strategies in this sort of box that you see. We have a robust training program, a train-the-trainer program in which we are training folks to actually go out and attempt to execute these normalizing concepts. We're organizing people in city government, and then we are operationalizing through the different tools and assessments and plans that we have, of which I'll talk just a little bit about in the next slide. Next slide, Sarah. So the tools that we have, all of these tools are accessible on our website at the Office of Equity, cityofsanantonio.gov. We have a budgeting for equity tool that we use where we are trying to examine and analyze top to bottom everything from programs and services to operations to hiring practices within departments. We analyze those through our budgeting processes and through department-wide equity assessments that we are doing and working our way through connecting and doing that work with each department to create 2-year equity action plans for each of those departments. We created a rapid response tool specifically to answer 4 questions around the pandemic. We have an equity training program that I've mentioned. We did a racial equity indicator report, and we do an annual report every year that kind of encompasses all the work that we do. Next slide, Sarah. Just briefly, and I'll flip through both of these slides pretty quickly. These are some highlights in what we've been able to do in the COVID response domain. We've really worked on housing security through evictions protections, rental and mortgage assistance programs, utility-based assistance programs, and we've worked hard on ensuring that students have access to both the tools that they need to be able to do digital learning from home and the resources that they need to be able to connect digitally. We also passed a resolution declaring racism as a public health crisis. Next slide, please, Sarah. This slide also highlights what we've been able to do in the workforce domain. We've been able to do a lot of targeted resources that have gone towards ensuring that folks are going to be prepared for the jobs that are going to be in the new economy, understanding the reality that some of our businesses will not come back after the pandemic. How then are we preparing our workforce to be able to move forward? So that's some of the highlights that have happened in workforce and providing childcare for folks, particularly frontline employees that are doing the work every day. I'll close out, Sarah, with the next slide of going to talk about our role in government as public servants. Cheryl Davis says it this way: as public servants, we must shine a light on disparities, reconcile past harms, and identify solutions. Working with these folks that are on this seminar today is what we're trying to do in the Office of Equity, and I'm just grateful that we had an opportunity to share a little bit with you all today. I think my next slide is my last slide, Sarah, and then I will hand it back over to you so that we can take a few of the questions that I know have popped up in the chat box.
Awesome. Great. So I'm really thankful we seem to have pretty much stuck to time. We have about 5 minutes for some questions, and I think some of us have answered some of them kind of as we go in the chat, but one question that I think is really important is from Eugenia asking, have you been addressing tensions, if any, between citywide or regional priorities production versus local needs in each sub-area? And that's something that we are really, really trying to get right. We also have a neighborhood housing and services department who kind of does a lot of our housing policy. So we're trying to work closely with them to align affordability with our land use plans, because if we are saying, yes, we want to grow, we want to build housing in these different places, we have to have the affordability protections in place in order to do that. I think some of our tensions come around when we start talking about affordability in the higher income areas. I think we're about to embark on a few studies on our north side, and I think that'll be kind of a big tension there. But that is something that as a city, we have to maintain our stance on these things and really push for it. And it's something that many city council members are committed to, and definitely something we have to negotiate. I'm going to jump to a question for Jonathan. Curious about the operational end of your equity strategies. How has this been operationalized through zoning bylaws, nuisance bylaws, and other ordinances, including building codes? So I guess this is kind of for both of us, so including conflicting policy goals. And I feel like that's been something that we really hope to address with the budget equity tool. Do you want to speak to that for a minute, Jonathan?
A great question, Amina. I think the first thing that we had to do was start breaking down some of the silos within the city. I think working with folks within the planning department and within neighborhoods.
It got really quiet for a second. I'm not sure why.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I think the short of what I was saying is we had to start breaking down some of the silos. Previously, departments are kind of regimented in operating and doing what they do. And when we think about all of the ways in which we intersect, our lives as human beings intersect anyway. We had to start working in that domain. And so I think what we've tried to do with folks in planning, and Sarah in particular, and with our neighborhood and housing services department, is really work to bring them together on problem solving in ways in which they had kind of been working together on, but when we start thinking about it through an equity application, we've got a lot of work that we're building on. So the way it translates now into, there's a strategic housing implementation plan that we are working on. Both Sarah has been included in those discussions. I've been included in those discussions. There are a host of partners within community that are working on some of those things, the policy recommendations that will come from changed ordinances, for example, in terms of universal design, in terms of how we do rezoning, how we do more density, right? Sarah talked about the need for more density, I think, particularly in downtown. So those are some of the ways in which we are all working together to try to do it. Sarah?
So I think one of these questions kind of encompasses several others questions in here, is if there is kind of distrust of the government and coming out. So I would say myself and Claudia and Anna, we're kind of out there trying to interact with people, where Jonathan's department is a little more internal facing. So the equity work is kind of within our departments, and then it's our job to go out there and push for it with our work. So Claudia, do you feel like there is distrust with any of the work that you do?
I think there's general distrust with historic preservation, because people think that historic preservation has always been for an elite group in San Antonio, and they think that it brings gentrification. The entire reason why my job was created is so that we wouldn't have that sort of thinking anymore. And that was, my job was actually created by citizens. We have a very empowered citizenry in San Antonio, And they are the ones who demanded that this job be created. And I was lucky enough to be the first one to get it. And really my job is to make sure that historic preservation is equitable for the entire community. So on a one-on-one basis, I have a lot of trust with communities. I don't, and we're breaking down some of those barriers for the rest of our department, but it's taken me 6 years to get them to feel that same trust with everyone in the department.
Would definitely say for the planning department, there is kind of like, why are you now? What are you doing? In the past, we only had neighborhood planning, so the most organized and kind of the neighborhoods with the most resources could get those neighborhood plans to drive how their future would look. But now we're trying to do it holistically. So they're like, well, what about my neighborhood plan? So there's some tension there. There's some tension with areas that have never been planned before. But it's something we're hoping to address. And we are out of time, but you're more than welcome to email us. I can try to get our emails and put them in the chat. This has been a really, really wonderful experience. Thank you all so much for joining us. And I guess it doesn't kick us out. So we're just, yeah. That was great. Thank y'all. This was so much fun.
High five, everyone.
Yay.
Thank everyone who joined us.
Yes, thank y'all so much.
Oh, please do come.
And yes, come visit. We're fun. It's hot here. It's like 85 right now, I think.
Do you miss the cold from New York?
I used to get sad in New York, like around March. I'd just get so sad. And I didn't realize what it was until I moved here. I'm like, oh, sunshine.
I do.
Oh, this is what spring is
love
supposed to look like.
I do love when it's cold though. Like this 85-degree November is a little, yeah. Vanessa, come visit.
I totally miss the seasons, and I miss that first day when you feel like all I have to do is wear a sweater today. I don't have to wear a coat. It's very special.
Yeah, that is.
All right.
It's raining in New York City. Oh no. It's sunny here, but there's a leaf blower outside.
Are there questions that we didn't answer that we want to get through? And is there a format for us to do that?
There's specifically some about the engagement process, how that's shifting with COVID. I think you answered the one about shotgun houses.
They want us
there
to
was some, yeah. Okay, they want to stand. All right, I can send them to y'all.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Bye.